Well, I'm afraid there is still a chemical weapons program in Syria. Putin he's struggling for soldiers for the front line. He's having to buy them off North Korea, for God's sake. So, having a problem down in Syria, in the Middle East, for him is the last thing he needed. And the fact that the Russians, police criminals who have tortured all those people in jail, they've run for the hills. But you still need a police force. You need a government institutions to run the fuel, the power, the water. When I left in 2020, I could never predict it. But now that it's happened and happened so rapidly, that is not a surprise. The Syrian army was always dreadful, led by tyrants, mainly friends of Assad. They have obviously run for the hills and the army collapsed.
Now we're joined by Hamish de Bretton Gordon. He was an arms inspector, and he well understands not only the nature of that regime, its crimes of chemical weapon attacks, torture, and various other crimes. He can give us a military and a strategic perspective on what this all means. So Hamish, obvious question, as I said, what is the significance of what's happening in Syria?
Those of us who've been involved in Syria really since the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011, this is a day we've all been waiting for, and for the people of Syria who've been under the tyrannical rule of the Assads for the last 50 years, it's the first time that family have not been ruling over them with the iron wrist, the iron will that they've had. So it is a great day, but the hard work starts tomorrow, and there is a lot of uncertainty. This is a very, very unstable world at the moment, but this is a good news story, and this might well have a positive impact elsewhere. But it's critical that Syria chooses its own way, leads what happens next, and the international community and everybody else give it as much possible support as they can.
Looking back at your time in Syria, the work you did 10 years or so ago, could you have foreseen then that the regime would be toppled this way?
Well, I think I would have hoped. And I know there's a lot of angst at the moment that HTS are, a jihadist-based organisation, and everybody remembers what happens after 2003. And I was part of the second Gulf War, as I was the first Gulf War, and when the transition went wrong and the jihadists took over. But I saw ISIS and Islamic State back in Syria back in sort of 2012, 2013. And then I saw HTS take over in 2015 and 2016 in northwest Syria. And the last time I was there was 2020. And they were a very, very different organisation from Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And they were trying to get things together. But for the last 4 years, I think everybody has taken their eye off Syria. And that is why we are where we are. In the last 4 years, the Free Syrian Army, HTS, the rebels, have been training. They look like professional soldiers to me. They look well trained and well equipped. And on the same sort of time period, the Syrian army has really taken their eye off the ball. And I think Assad as well. Assad, some people have been welcoming him back into an international community, which is dreadful. So when the opportunity arises, and he was propped up by Putin without a shadow of a doubt, but we've seen over the last few weeks and months, Putin is really stretched. He can't afford to have fighter jets down in Syria. He can't afford to have other equipment, and that has whittled away. And that gave the opportunity for the rebels to go on the march, as we've seen. So when I left in 2020, I could never predict it. But now that it's happened and happened so rapidly, that is not a surprise. The Syrian army was always dreadful, led by tyrants, mainly friends of Assad. They have obviously run for the hills and the army collapsed. Whereas the rebels, with a big hint of sort of advice and training, no doubt from the Turks and others, have marched forward. And this is a public uprising. I haven't spoken to any Syrians, be they in Syria or out of Syria, who don't welcome this move. And what happens next in the transition is going to be absolutely key, and hopefully for a brighter day tomorrow.
So, Paul, one of the extraordinary things is this rebellion, this sort of insurrection, this toppling of the Assad regime seems to have taken place without much outside help. Now, you wrote an article today and you say that Syrians themselves have to control what happens next. And what did you mean by that?
Well, I was having, spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. The transition or failed transition in 2003, bears very heavily on me. And when I say it must be Syrian-led, is that's what I mean. It's up to the people of Syria to decide. It's all these situations are different. Iraq isn't Syria, and Syria isn't Afghanistan. You must face them as they come up. But it must be Syrian-led. It must be Arab-led. Now, the West has a part to play here. We have the resources, we have the expertise, and also we mustn't enforce on Syria what we did in Iraq. In Iraq, we collapsed the army the next day. We collapsed the police. We basically collapsed the government. That created anarchy. Now we must avoid that. And my article is basically saying, please don't repeat the mistakes of Iraq. The Syrian army needs to keep going. Those criminal generals have run, and we've already heard of a couple of thousand Syrian army soldiers running for the border because they're obviously the ones who meted out the torture. But there'll be others who can come in and deal with it. Same with the police. The police criminals who have tortured all those people in jail, they've gone. They've run for the hills. But you still need a police force. You need a government institutions to run the fuel, the power, the water, the sewage system, which has been decimated over the last 10 or so years. So you need the civil servants around to do it. And I'm heartened by the outgoing Prime Minister saying that he will try and facilitate that. And, if the leader of HTS is as good as what he's saying today, that he will facilitate it. We know Syria is a moderate country overall. It's a secular country. And, the chance to have a secular society in future is there. I remember a great Syrian doctor friend of mine telling me when he left Syria in about 2010, I think it was, the head of the religious ministry in the Syrian government was a Christian. So, there is hope if things are done correctly and the right support is given and nothing is imposed on the Syrians that they don't want themselves.
So, Hamish, can I just ask you, why is this happening now? Is it to do with Russia depleting its military, the ruble collapsing, or is it to do with the war, Israel's war in Lebanon, Hamas and Hezbollah, and they attacked Hezbollah? So why now?
Well, I suppose there are two answers to this. What I think and what I hope. I think it was a strategic error for Putin, first of all, to get involved. But this was his southern flank. He needed that warm water port called Tartus, which is on the eastern Mediterranean coast in the Alawite area, which is probably the only area that is still not under control of the people of Syria at the moment. But it was clear that his war in Ukraine, as we've discussed many times, has eaten up so many resources that he can't afford to have fighter jets and he can't afford to have a commitment down on his southern border. So he had to withdraw. But it's sort of shown that how sort of weak Putin has become, really. But it's a combination. Iran, I think, is also very much on the demise. That their proxies, Hezbollah and their proxies in Iraq, who've been sort of bolstering the Assad regime, for even longer than Putin was. They have disappeared. They have done nothing. So I think for Iran and for Russia, they are much poorer today, and that is a good thing because a weak Moscow is really what we need at the moment, because everybody wants a ceasefire in Ukraine and everybody wants peace, but on terms that the people of Ukraine direct and Zelensky directs, not on what Putin directs. So I think and hope he is much diminished, and I hope this might well precipitate peace in Ukraine and also elsewhere. Other tyrants like the mullahs in Iran. Hopefully that will prevent them stretching their sort of evil intent around the place, and hopefully even Kim Jong-un will realise in North Korea that his great friends that he thought were all powerful and would back him up probably aren't. So there are a number of ways this can go, but if the Syrians do what they need to do and are properly supported by the international community, then at the moment I'm hopeful for a much better tomorrow for Syria than they've had for the last 50 years. And lots of things have happened in a relatively short space of time. And unbeknownst to the world, it would appear that the rebels have been training for this very, very moment. We all knew that the Syrian people hated Assad and wanted to see the back of him. But they needed that sort of push in order for them to support it. But we've seen that a lot of the Iranian militias and Hezbollah and Hamas and to an extent the Houthis down in Yemen have been much denuded by what has happened in Israel and have been struck down. We've also seen that Iran, when it's trying to respond with its missiles, has been completely ineffective against Western technology. And we've seen that Putin he's struggling for soldiers for the front line. He's having to buy them off North Korea, for God's sake. So having a problem down in Syria, in the Middle East, for him is the last thing he needed. And the fact that the Russians, sort of folded up shop and disappeared so quickly, even with their great desire to have the port in Tartus, is really the sort of situation that we're seeing there. So, yeah, there are many ways this can go, and hopefully people will hold their nerve. Hopefully the West won't try and get too involved, except to give resources and advice, and hopefully the Gulf states will step forward, because I think I said earlier, this needs to be an Arab solution. This is where the Saudis and others with their big deep pockets can help out, and they know the language, the religion, the political setup far better than any Westerner could. So if everybody pulls together in the right direction, then there is chance, and I think if we can see peace in Syria, that there is no reason why we can't see peace in Europe, in Ukraine as well, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Trump was in Paris at the reopening of Notre Dame to meet Macron, the French president, and the Ukrainian president, Zelensky. He was apparently wearing a mixture of yellow and blue, the colours of his shirt and his tie. Is this a secret signal? What is going on with Trump, who's often been quite dismissive about Ukraine and seemed to take Putin's side?
I think the mood music has changed coming out of Washington really in the last few weeks. And, dare I say it, Trump he likes to win, he likes success. And perhaps when he looked at Ukraine, a few months ago, he didn't see a path to it. But what better way to start his presidency than a ceasefire on Zelensky's, to Zelensky's terms in January? Apart from him, he won't be the pariah that a lot of people think he is. He'll be the great hero who's delivered Ukraine from the jaws of the Russians. So, yeah, I think a lot of these things are interlinked, but it's sort of timing as well. So, yeah, let's hope for a brighter day in Ukraine tomorrow and in Syria and elsewhere.
So, Hamish, your expertise is on chemical weapons, and you know better than I do. There's a stash of chemical weapons the Assad regime has kept. It's been well documented how it used those weapons on its own citizens. But what's going to happen to that stash of chemical weapons now?
Well, I'm afraid there is still a chemical weapons program in Syria. In my opinion, Assad has stayed in power so long because he used chemical weapons. The proudest thing in my life was hunting down the evidence for 7 years in Syria of these chemical weapons. And people might have forgotten there is an arrest warrant out for Assad for the use of chemical weapons against his own people. And, I'm very proud that a lot of my evidence forms part of that arrest warrant. But now we have to secure these chemical weapons. I think the West, the US and Western intelligence knows where they are. and the Organisation for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the UN's body to deal with this sort of thing, hopefully are on the border, ready to go and ready to secure them. I've already heard that some of the southern rebels have asked for the OPCW to come in and do that, and that must be a priority. That is where the international community needs to get involved to secure these weapons, because lots of people remember the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine's nuclear weapons were taken away, and half the reason that there is a war in Ukraine is because Russia didn't honour that agreement. But apart from that, when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 90s, a lot of other nuclear and chemical weapons were dealt with and taken out of harm's way, and it's a key role that needs to be done now to make sure that those chemical weapons, and there's probably still a lot of the deadly nerve agent sarin around, which needs to be removed from Syria and destroyed as soon as possible.
Hamish, again, thank you. Great insights. Joining us now is Jimmy Rushton. He's spent the last few years in Ukraine. He's a security expert and also an expert on the Putin regime, how he uses military power, and on the Assad regime and how they've worked together after all these years becoming so apparent. So, Jimmy, let me ask you what I've asked everybody so far on this program. What do you make of these momentous events?
Well, they're absolutely historic, really, and not completely out of the blue, because people who'd been watching the regime for a long time recognised that it was weakening, that behind the facade there was, a state that was completely hollowed out, really, that had become a narco state that was distributing huge amounts of Captacon, which is a kind of a synthetic amphetamine, that really enjoyed no popular base of support, and that was being kept in power by external actors, so Iran and Russia. But obviously we weren't expecting this absolutely catastrophic collapse of the regime, which is just, I don't think even HTS were expecting this. It was successful beyond their wildest dreams. And the scenes that we're seeing in Syria, people celebrating, very reminiscent of the early days of the revolution in 2011. I remember watching these very, very well. People on the streets with revolutionary flags, all sects across Syria: Kurds, Druze, Alawis, and Christians as well. So it's really, it's incredibly momentous, and it's for people that have watched this for a long time. Finally seeing these people get what they so justly deserve, which is freedom from this horrific regime, it's incredibly heartwarming, touching, but also frustrating that they've had to wait for so long, and the West has so catastrophically kind of mishandled the situation, in my opinion.
So just that mishandling, Jimmy. So there was a move, wasn't there, in 2012, to some Western intervention when the repression of the spring, the revolution took place. And obviously Britain backed off, Obama backed off, Ed Miliband famously didn't support Cameron. Do you regret that now? Do you think that was a missed opportunity? There was understandable reluctance among some people because the interventions in Libya and Iraq hadn't maybe gone well. But do you think that was a key moment that was missed?
Absolutely. I was absolutely for intervention at the time, and my opinion has never changed. I think we have to look at what the intervention was potentially going to do, and the most common model of intervention that was proposed at the time was something similar to Libya, which was a no-fly zone. So it would have grounded the Syrian Air Force. It would have probably involved airstrikes on chemical weapons facilities and heavy weaponry, so artillery, and these are the weapons which have caused the absolute massive amounts of casualties in Syria. The barrel bombing, the heavy artillery that Assad has used. That the rebels really had no defences against aircraft, heavy artillery. They could, and they did, hold areas of Syria, with small arms against the regime, and we had areas of the capital, for example, which held out for years, that were only broken after chemical weapons attacks, for example. So yeah, I absolutely regret it. I mean, going back to Libya, So we can look at the, I mean, obviously they're very different countries with very different historical contexts, but you can look at the kind of, if you look at the percentage of displaced people, externally displaced people, the number of casualties in the relevant, conflicts, there's no comparison, right? Libya is compared to Syria, it's, paradise compared to Syria. Syria is horrific, like millions of people displaced, close to 1 million people probably dead. Torture beyond the most depraved stories that came out of the Third Reich. Women, children being tortured to death in Assad's prisons. I mean, just absolutely horrific stuff. And again, we need to look at what we were proposing, right? We weren't proposing an invasion. We weren't proposing Allied boots on the ground. All we were doing, and to be fair, at the time, the Syrians weren't actually even asking for this. What the Syrians were saying is close the skies and we'll do the rest ourselves. We could have done that. It would have been relatively cheap, and we wouldn't have had to deal with, the massive influx of refugees, the rise of ISIS, which was, ISIS was partly a creation of the regime. The regime deliberately released the most violent Islamists from the Syrian prisons while locking up moderate opposition figures. So, it was a catastrophic mistake, and Syrians have mainly paid the price. Although, Western societies in Europe, we've had political destabilization from refugee flows, and that was, it was all avoidable, to be honest.
There's two things that make me think of. One is actually one of the videos from one of the occupied or liberated or invaded Russian bases showed that they had fake ISIS uniforms. So there's a lot of provocation there, and that sort of brings my question about Putin's intent, because in the vacuum left by the West, Putin established a naval base there, and in a way, didn't he practice the tactics of air bombardments, heavy artillery, all the sort of merciless attack on civilians, which we've seen in Ukraine? Is that another kind of consequence of 10 years ago that really Putin was emboldened? And had something been done in 2012, we might not have had 2014, the invasion of Donbass and annexation of Crimea, and maybe not 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. He smelt Western weakness. It was obvious. And he, Putin, he's never been a strategic genius, but what he has done very well is he's exploited weakness when he sensed it, and he sensed weakness. I mean, there was a famous press conference where John Kerry and Lavrov were talking about chemical weapons, and John Kerry, who to be honest, unfortunately was never the smartest Secretary of State, was bounced into an agreement with Lavrov because he just kind of, he spoke out of turn about chemical weapons, and Lavrov kind of jumped on it and then kind of bounced Kerry into agreeing to this a Russian supervised process where Assad would get rid of his chemical weapons. Of course, he didn't get rid of his chemical weapons because there were chemical weapons attacks for years afterwards. But it was a case of Russia really sensing Western weakness. Their intervention, which began in 2015, could never have happened had we intervened in 2013, because if we'd have implemented a no-fly zone, Russia just wouldn't have intervened at that point. So yeah, again, Putin smelt weakness, exploited it, and well, here we are. And you're right, he did absolutely perfect some of the tactics used in Ukraine. The Wagner group grew massively in Syria. The Prigozhin, he built his power base in Syria. We saw attacks on hospitals in Syria. We've seen that in Ukraine, not quite to the extent that we saw in Syria, but we've still seen it. So yeah, for sure, definitely far-reaching consequences of those decisions.
What is its future? Is it to fall into these enclaves, kind of warring, different warlords are kind of falling apart of the state? Or do you believe, especially the way they've worked together, these various rebel groups, in toppling Assad, there is a hope for keeping the state together, some kind of democratic society? What's the future of Syria look like to you now?
Oh yeah. So yeah, I think going back to what I was saying about Libya is people can live relatively decent lives even if there is not centralized political control in the country, and you've seen that in Syria. You've seen for many years, you've seen divided. The SDF, for example, have controlled the east of the country. Then you've had the HTS controlling Idlib, and then you've had the regime controlling, central Syria. But you've also had kind of localized control, like some of the Druze areas that we saw rise up against the regime. They've been quite autonomous, and they've been governing their own kind of areas. So I don't think it's going to be challenging, but I think there is a genuine feeling that all Syrians of all kind of sects, Alawites, Christians, Druze, etc., Kurds, they all need to come together, and they all need to build something that is better than what was before. That there's no future in kind of constant fighting and repression. And I think that it's been a long 14 years, and I think a lot of people are going to just be tired of fighting, and they just really want to get some normality and just kind of live the life that we enjoy living in the UK, or we don't enjoy living in Ukraine. But
Thank you all for watching with our great experts giving you insight, people who know what they're talking about. And so if you enjoy watching our work, have no oligarchs or Russian funds looking after us, so you can subscribe, join Byline TV as a member, or subscribe to Byline Times. Meanwhile, we'll see you very soon when we have some more news on Frontline Byline.